Okay, so I'm really excited to be introducing Phil Goldberg. He says he's been with us at least 4 or 5 times. He's been studying the world's spiritual traditions for more than 50 years as a practitioner, teacher, and writer. He is a meditation teacher who was trained in 1970 by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, which is the same year that Ted and I were initiated into transcendental meditation. He's an ordained interfaith minister, spiritual counselor, and acclaimed public speaker who has lectured and conducted workshops in a variety of venues in the US and India. A prolific writer, his articles have appeared in numerous publications, and he's authored or co-authored more than 20 books, including The Intuitive Edge, Road Signs on the Spiritual Path, Living at the Heart of Paradox, the award-winning American Veda, From Emerson and the Beatles to Yoga and Meditation, which is one of the most fascinating books in the world. I just love that book. And The Life of Yogananda. So he blogs regularly on Elephant Journal and Spirituality and Health, and co-hosts the popular Spirit Masters podcast. And he also leads American Veda tours to India, which would be absolutely amazing and fascinating. So welcome back, Phil. Take it over.
Good to be with you again, Diana, in this strange way. I miss breaking bread with the Inside Edge people in person. You know, when you were reading some of those book titles, I realized I gave presentations at the Edge for every one of them.
Yes. Yes, you did. I remember The Intuitive Edge. That was a long time ago.
A long time. That was in the 80s, yes.
Obvious question to ask you. I know in my life, I've had sort of a magical knowing sometimes that led me into taking the next step in my life. And I'm just wondering, your book is so timely. How in the world how did you know to get that book written?
You know, the book was officially published last month in early August. And, you know, so I've been doing a lot of interviews. And everybody compliments me on the timeliness of the book, as if I knew how crazy the world would be in August of 2020. But the truth is, I conceived of the book early last year, in early stages of 2019, when, you know, the world was crazy then. You know, it seems sane by comparison, but you know, people were telling me how difficult they were, how much difficulty they were having with world conditions, how anxious they were, how fearful, how worried, how angry. And I kept seeing the need for people to utilize the repertoire of spiritual practices that we have available to us. And I saw people making excuses not to. And that led me to write an article about that. And that led, you know, my publisher and I to say, Hay House is the publisher. And we said, you know, let's do a book. So the book was done. And we, when the pandemic hit, and just before the lockdown, we said, we have, you know, a day or two to make changes in the book before it goes to print. But we decided not to, because we decided that any time can be crazy for anybody, and the information and advice and methods in the book are perennial. And so I just added a little paragraph. So I wish I could take credit for knowing in advance, but something was going on, as you said. There was some guidance that said, you know, scheduling a book for August might be a good idea.
Well, I think you had some kind of guidance to get us to get the, because it's so full of so many wonderful ideas. So let me ask you, what do you really mean by an inventory of spiritual practices?
Well, there are two premises in the book, I think, that carry through, and these are teachings that, you know, orientation that I've gleaned from all the world's spiritual traditions that have guided me in my spiritual path. And the key premise is one that we can all verify in our own experience, and that is that we have within us what I call a sanctuary of peace and a fortress of strength. It's our true nature. It's at the core of our being. And spiritual practices are meant to give us access to that. The world's spiritual traditions have given us sort of maps to that inner sanctuary and keys to opening the door, and we need to utilize them. And so the book is designed to help people create for themselves a repertoire or an inventory or pantry shelves filled with spiritual practices that they can use, that fit the moment, that fit the needs of that period in their lives. And I advocate that people have a regular spiritual practice, one that brings them for a sustained period of time every day into that inner sanctuary of peace, so they establish it as a foundation for the rest of their activities in that day. And over time, that kind of regular deep practice, meditation or mindfulness or deep, really deep prayer for an extended period of time, or a combination, will cultivate that condition of inner peace, so we have some equanimity in the midst of the craziness. And then I guide people into creating an inventory of practices ranging from things you can do in under a minute or under 5 minutes to things that might, if you have a half hour or an hour or a weekend or a month. So to create in a written form an inventory of things you can do to put you back in touch as needed with that inner sanctuary, and help you cultivate inner peace and strength to hold, to sustain you and protect you.
Yeah, great. Well, I think a lot of us are feeling a certain amount of anger. And you, I know, have something to say about how anger can be constructively channeled as a spiritual practice. I think that would be really fun to hear about.
Yes, and a key to that is having the anger, if when it erupts, when it arises, to arise on a sort of pillow, you could say, or a foundation of some inner peace, so that you're aware of the anger when it comes. That's one of the virtues of cultivating the habit of sustaining some equanimity, some inner stability and clarity of mind, so that you say, oh yes, I'm getting angry, as opposed to being consumed by it instantaneously. But what I've learned, and I'm going to say that, what I say about this and other things in the book comes largely from the mystical traditions of all the world's traditions. But I tried wherever possible to also recommend practices that have also been sort of validated with scientific research, because inner practices have become a subject of great scientific investigation. And it's clear that if you can remember to pause when strong emotions arise, such as anger and fear, and just feel it, or maybe take an intervening breath or two, so that you don't get overwhelmed and you don't respond in the heat of that anger, but can pause long enough for the sensation to diminish and some mental clarity to ensue. And then you can convert the anger, not necessarily try to drive it away or pretend it doesn't exist, or enter into a sort of denial of your anger, but to convert it from rage into something more sustainable, such as indignation. Moral indignation is a sort of acceptable and workable emotion.
Mm.
Outrage and rage that's when we make mistakes. That's when we say and do things we later regret. That's when, you know, we create more trouble than we already have. But if you can achieve some calmness and some distance and convert it into, instead of I'm enraged, into something is going on that needs my attention because it's dangerous, or it's creating problems for people I love or for myself, and I have to address this in a creative and intelligent way, then
I
you're
like,
converting the anger.
I like that. Yeah, I think that so many of us just don't want to feel the pain, and it is a physical sensation in the body, isn't it? It's something that we can locate in the body,
Yes.
actually feel and acknowledge. And I know Pema Chodron says that if you feel it for 90 seconds and let it, it'll dissipate, you know, but we have so much resistance to what's going on.
That's interesting that she, a Buddhist teacher,
Mhm.
would say 90 seconds, because I mention in my book scientific research by neuroscientists at Stanford who I quote saying exactly that. 90 seconds
Mhm.
seems to be, if you can just feel a strong emotion without acting on it,
Right.
just witness it for about 90 seconds, it runs a cycle neurophysiologically that then afterwards gives you more access to your conscious thinking, to the clarity of the mind, so you can either choose to continue feeling it, or you can convert it and act in a more, you know, calm and sensible way.
You also
Fascinating.
said you answered about breathing, and I noticed in the book that you have about the abdominal breathing and so on.
Mm.
That the breathing is a way of taking a break from uncomfortable feelings. Can you address that and maybe?
Yeah, I have one of the chapters in the book is about immediate interventions, you know, as opposed to spiritual practices you might do on a regular basis to cultivate inner peace. There's moments when you need to intervene and you know, tap into some of that inner peace. And, you know, the old um, classic advice of take a deep breath has validity, but there are things you can do to augment the effectiveness of taking a deep breath. And so I have several methods in there that are proven, you know, some from the yogic tradition that go back thousands of years, and some from modern science, and some combination of that. And one of them is, you know, is the most simple thing. If you breathe, when we're upset, especially, we have a tendency to breathe into the chest. We go like this. But if you breathe what yogis call a belly breath, and psychologists call abdominal breathing, by pushing out the abdomen, like you're inflating a balloon, and breathing in, you bring in more oxygen to parts of the lungs that maybe have built up too much carbon dioxide, and it's more calming. And you can do this inconspicuously, even when people are watching, just extending the belly and taking a longer breath in. And let's continue it, some of this advice. So deep abdominal breathing. But then when you exhale, if you extend the exhale, just, you know, normally you go and then take another inhale, but just keep exhaling. And to do that, you pull in the abdomen. And if you extend the exhale, maybe 50% longer than you normally would, there's a physiological reaction that's mediated by the vagus nerve, and it's remarkably calming. And if you just try it, you'll see that just extending it, do it for a few breaths, you'll feel different.
It really is very effective. That longer exhale is just terrific. I use that quite often, and nobody can see it, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
You also talk about flipping the mind as a technique. Can you give us a little information on that?
Well, people like our current company are, very familiar with positive thinking. And that too, is ancient. Spiritual teachers from all the parts of the world have talked about converting negative thoughts, the usual suspects of anger and fear and all the rest, into their opposites. So when we're angry, we flip to something more loving or compassionate. But it's not quite as simple as it sounds, especially when the thoughts are accompanied by strong emotions. And anybody who has tried to convince themselves, you may have watched the debate last night and hated one or the other of the two candidates. You are not likely to say, oh, hate isn't a good emotion, so I'm going to love that person. It's not easy to do. So and so is harming people. I'm going to love that person. But you can flip from hate or rage to something more positive. It doesn't have to be about that person or this situation. So I quote somebody in the book who is angry at a politician, couldn't bring herself to loving that person, but could feel compassion for the people she felt were being harmed by that person's policies. And that's a kind of flipping of the mind into something more positive without you having to lie to yourself. Because the subconscious knows when you're full of it. And if you were to say, oh, I'm not worried about the toxins in the environment, everything will be fine, when you really are worried about it, or whatever the situation may be. I'm not worried about my child's doing such and such. You are worried. You're not going to fool yourself, but you can flip it so that I'm concerned about this situation and I'm going to do something about it. That's a much more positive emotion than I'm terribly upset, but you don't have to trick yourself. And then your subconscious will rally to you and support the different thought process and different emotion, instead of saying, oh, please, you're just fooling yourself here. This is nonsense. You're not you can't kid me. So
I like that. That's really good.
Yeah.
Changing the subject completely, I think it would be really interesting to hear you define the nuances between meditation and mindfulness.
Oh, yeah, I'm as Diana mentioned, I've been meditating. I have to mention this. I'm a Kaiser Permanente is my health provider, and I got a mailing from them recently that recommended I meditate for stress. And and my thought was, well, you're half a century too late in my case, but it's really good that you're doing this, because people need to hear this. And it's just a measure of how acceptable these things are, because I can assure you, when people like Diana and me were meditating back when we were young, it was weird to people. But anyway, so I'm a strong advocate of a deep meditation practice on a regular basis. But what I find is people have excuses for not doing it, and we could talk about that, later. But one of the reasons people get confused is because meditation is very is discussed in the press in a very simplistic way, and there's a lot of overlapping conversation about mindfulness and meditation, and sometimes they're linked, they're linked together so that any inner practice is called, mindfulness. But in many ways, they don't overlap. And so I write about this in the book and have guidance for, taking on an easy meditation practice. But the distinction I like to make is between methods that are easy and effortless and natural on the one hand, and efforts that require a great deal of mind control and attention, trying to focus. Mindfulness typically involves some degree of paying attention to something, paying attention to the breath, paying attention to sensory experiences, many different kinds of mindfulness practices. Some are very gentle, some require rigorous attention. And similarly, practices called meditation are sometimes you concentrate on this, and sometimes concentration is absolutely forbidden. You don't concentrate, you effortlessly do letting go kind of practice. So these distinctions are terribly important, especially if you take on a practice that you're going to do on your own at home. The more control of the mind they call for, the more difficult they are, and the less pleasant they can be, and you're less likely to follow up and do them. Whereas methods that require less effort, that are natural and easy, are actually more relaxing, more calming, and more pleasant. So you'll do them. And, so there's a lot to be said about this, but that's the synopsis.
Okay, well, I know that you give some very, very simple instructions in the book for meditation that are very valuable for people who are just beginning to meditate, and then lots and lots more information for those who've been meditating a long time. Since we've been in lockdown, we haven't been able to see each other much. We haven't been able to go out and socialize. But one thing that you do talk about is nature as a sacrament. And it is a time when we can be out walking and when we can become much more aware of our environment. We talk about nature as a sacrament.
Yes, I have a chapter in the book about utilizing sacred spaces. And of course, I wrote the book before there was a lockdown. So some of the sacred places I mention as examples are sort of, people aren't going to churches and synagogues, for example, and a lot of public places, indoor places, are closed. So we don't have those sacred spaces. But we can create sacred spaces in our homes, and we still do, especially those of us in Southern California, we still do have access to nature. And, I'm looking out my sliding door right now, and there are flowers and greenery. I can sit in my backyard and just look at the rhododendron, what's out there? I have flowers. Bougainvillea. I'm looking at bougainvillea right now, and there's a mango tree. A guava tree, and that's just my little backyard. But you can, going into nature is one of the most soothing and healing things we can do, to just be there, to be in the presence of trees and whatever, even little wildlife, chipmunks and squirrels and birds. The innocence of it all, the pristine nature of it all, and just the vibe, the feeling of it. It's terribly important. Many of us here live close enough to the ocean to take a walk on the beach or to, a nature preserve. I can drive 20 minutes and go for a hike, and it's an escape. But there's something so healing about it. But what we get out of being in nature, we should always remember, has a lot to do with what we bring to it. So I mentioned in the book, and I've noticed this, I go for walks on the beach here in Marina del Rey fairly often. And some days I'm walking on the beach and I might as well be in in a gym without windows because I'm just getting exercise and I'm not present. Other times I look at the same view, the same ocean, the same walking on the same sand, seeing the same hills and the same sky, and I'm in bliss and I'm grateful and I'm in ecstasy and I feel at one with everything. What's the difference? It's the same beach. It's the same woods. It's the same. And sometimes I'm just might as well be anywhere else. It's what I bring to it. So the more attention, the more consciousness, the more heart you bring to it, the more gratitude you bring to it, the calmness you bring to it. Sometimes I go for a hike in the woods and I'm just walking. Other times I say, wait a minute, this is precious. Slow down. Look. Stand still for a moment. Look at the trees. Look at the details. This is going to open your heart. This is going to heal you. And so having the proper intention makes all the difference.
Yeah, it's really about presence, isn't it? I know
Yes.
Ted and I go walking here in Palm Springs very early in the mornings because we're still in the triple over 110 very late in the year here. And I noticed that there's this one tree that seems to call to me. So I'm actually a tree hugger. I mean, I can almost feel that tree calling me every morning to come over and just put my cheek against it and be there. Being present is the secret, isn't it? Don't you think?
Yes, being present with what is there and paying attention. And you don't have to be an old hippie like Diana and hug the tree if you're worried. You don't have to, if people are watching, you may not want to hug the tree, or you may want to do it anyway. Hug the tree, feel it. And it's a great thing. And I love that you do that. And I know that feeling. There's a certain tree on the hike my wife and I take almost every Sunday morning. We call it our niece's tree because she once, sort of fell in love with that tree. But there's something special about that. And things like that call to us. It may be just the plant in your living room, but there's something precious. And, the divine is present everywhere. I talk about that a lot in the book. Every spiritual tradition will tell you, whether they use the God word or other words for it, the divine, the sacred, the infinite is present in the finite. And sometimes being in nature is what is easiest. It's easier to access it in nature than it is, in a library or something. But even that, every place is sacred if we acknowledge it, if we recognize it. I forget the exact quote, but there's one of the spiritual traditions I cite in the book says that this place where you are right now, God has marked that place for you at this moment. And that presence is there. We just have to be open to it.
Yeah, it's the word surrender comes to mind. So we are just about done with our interview, and we're going to go into our breakout sessions, Morali. So if you can start getting us ready to go into breakout sessions. Phil, do you want to introduce? We have two questions there. Do you want to introduce the questions?
Okay, the questions are, one question: what is your biggest challenge in having a regular spiritual practice? And a related question: what is missing from your spiritual repertoire? What's your biggest challenge in having a regular practice? What's missing from your repertoire?
We had a good one, actually. Very vivacious group this morning. So who would like to share something? You can raise your hand down. Let's see, we've got Pamela, and I know, yeah, go ahead, Pamela.
It's just a quickie. No, it's just, we learn from each other. And Diana talked about tapping, which also was a little boring for me. And meditation was boring, but then she put together, she taps before she meditates, and somehow the two together. Now that sounds intriguing. So I'm going to check about tapping and then in focusing before meditation, and that might enliven the whole thing.
Oh, I hope so. That would be great. Lisa, I know you had something that was fun to share too.
Oh, one of the things that is really wonderful is when you're out in nature and you're underneath trees where they form together like a canopy above you. That is actually our physical cells in our body respond to it. And it is such a powerful practice. In Japan, it's called tree bathing. Tree bathing. So if you are, out in nature and you're underneath the trees, just stand underneath them and feel the energy coming into you and your cells.
Good. I see Brooke had his hand up. What do you have to say?
Yes. With Bill and David, we had a great meeting of the male minds.
You're good. How did that happen?
And I learned something. So part of the conversation became each of them expressing the obstacle that the media is, that email and Facebook is to meditating, and that their meditations are connected to their devices. So it seemed to me that, and this is Diana's initial question opening the session about that it's part of a meditation practice, what it takes to get away from input that you don't want, that is that doesn't support you. Like, how do you, just that? I mean, before you say your mantra, you got to turn off you got to get somewhere where you can be there. And that's part of the practice too.
Yeah, good. Well, we're going to go for some questions for Phil right
actually, Diana, there's been a hand up. Bill's had his hand up for a bit. So could we do that first? And also maybe let Phil respond as well.
Yeah,
so basically Brooke covered it. I think we came to the conclusion, fine before Facebook and fine before cell phones. And the cell phones are a distraction and Facebook is a distraction, and they're designed to be distractions. They're designed to suck you in and take up all your time. And email, Facebook is a black hole. And if I can stay on schedule, or a way to stay on schedule, is just don't do email or Facebook, or just realize that once you do Facebook, you're down the rabbit hole. If you have a lot of friends comment and you're subscribed to maybe some YouTube services, or forget it. It's just 2 or 3 hours go by, 4 hours go by, and you've accomplished nothing other than distracting, mostly meaningless in Facebook. I mean, it's nice to connect with friends, particularly old friends. And it's nice to know what's going on in the news, but you could probably get the news or most of it in an hour at 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 o'clock, whatever.
At night.
Yeah, at night. So you don't have to get these news flashes that ring on your phone all day. And unfortunately, our phone has become the go-to item where through business now. And if you're still involved in a business, you have to be attentive to your phone because so much comes through your phone. But then many of the things that distract you also come through your phone. And these distracting services take advantage of that. And Facebook is really one of them. It's the worst. And email in general is a black hole. So,
good point. Let's turn that into a question for Phil. Did you want to say anything about that?
Oh my God, there's so much to say. I address all this in my book. There was a lot in there. Let me just address the last thing first. I'm not immune to this. I found myself the other day getting angry at a news thing on television. And I realized it was the third time that day I got angry at the same news. I didn't need three newscasts to come to the same conclusions. And so, yes, there's a certain amount of discipline we have to exact to tune out. I talk about the importance of taking Sabbaths, taking, getting away from our devices. And, before there was smartphones and email and everything else, people would get lost in watching junk on television. And so, if you are inclined to be distracted in those ways, the difference now is everything seems important. Every email seems important. And there's little solutions we can do. Like I have two different email addresses, and one is, business stuff. So if I have to pay attention to that, I do it, but I shut off the notifications. I don't want to be pinged every time a text or an email comes in. I'll just look at them when I can. And I have to remember, if someone sends me an email, I don't have to read it immediately. I don't have to respond immediately unless it requires that. But there's a sense of urgency that's come over us that we, each of us, have to, find our way into the use of the positive usage of these technologies and protecting ourselves from the excess that sucks us in, as Bill said. Now, some of it is establishing a regular spiritual practice, it doesn't have to be the same time every day, but I strongly advocate creating a routine of a daily practice. So that's part of your daily repertoire, like showering and, eating or getting your exercise. I'm taking these 20 minutes or this half hour, I'm going to do these spiritual practices. I'm going to do them every day. I'm going to start my day with that, or end my day with that, or take a break in the mid-afternoon, whatever it is. But that way it becomes a routine, not a luxury, not a sometime thing when you feel like it, but a regular thing, like that's like regular maintenance.
Yeah, it's about commitment and priorities, isn't it?
Yes, and think of it as an investment. Mm-hmm. This is a better investment of my time than another 15 minutes of useless Facebook stuff.
I love that. I love that as an investment. We have a fun question from you, Anne. What is in your armamentarium to center in addition to meditating and being in nature?
So 200 pages of them in here.
It really is a very, very generous book. I must say, you have given us a huge number of techniques, and practices, and ways of listening to inner guidance and all of those things.
Yeah, I try to call on the full, expanse of methods that we have available to us: mental practices, physical practices, spiritual practices, things we think of as spiritual. But I also want to encourage people to understand that anything that uplifts you, anything that puts you in touch with your inner self, your inner peace, your inner wisdom, can be understood as a spiritual practice. So in that chapter on immediate interventions, and in the chapter where I encourage people to create an inventory of things you can do in different time slots, you may only have a couple of minutes that you need a break. You need to tune into your inner self. And maybe the thing that calls you at that moment is a song. And it doesn't have to be a so-called spiritual song, a hymn, or a chant. Those, I have guidance for, chanting and all that in the book, and prayer. But sometimes, listening to the blues or rock and roll or a show tune or whatever it is that uplifts you, that opens your heart. Sometimes watching a sad movie is, in a strange way, a deep attunement in a way. And sometimes, you know, seeing something goofy and funny will uplift you and put you in. So I encourage everybody to broaden the definition of spiritual practice. Spiritual practice is whatever brings you in touch with the divinity within yourself. And it could be something, you know, that you're doing while you're walking. One of the little inconspicuous practices I encourage people to do, and it was prompted by the fact that we can't touch and hug the way we used to. But you may be out, you know, walking or running errands and see other human beings. The Indian greeting, which I love when I'm in India and I take tour groups to India, everybody goes like this and they say namaste. And what does namaste mean? The intention is the divinity in me recognizes the divinity in you, and go like this. And that could be done routinely, just like saying hi, or it could be done in a conscious way, that namaste, I am recognizing the divinity in you. And one of the things I learned is you can be out in the street and you may not want to go like this to every stranger you pass, but you can think it. You can offer them a namaste as you pass them. I recognize the divinity in that person. It's for you.
That's great. You know, it's a huge shift, really, because when we are getting depressed, it's because we have our attention on ourselves. But just by namaste, we are acknowledging the divinity.
And thank you for mentioning that, Diana, because one of the things I talk about in the book is the need for spiritual citizenship. Those of us who are deeply spiritual people need to make a contribution and make the world a little less sane, a little less insane. And so whatever it is, those little acts of service, you know, if you're so inclined, you know, volunteering to feed people, or, you know, go to the hospital, or if you're politically inclined to work on a political campaign, but that's not for everybody. But calling your neighbor, calling an elderly person, seeing if they need help, calling someone who's sick, calling an old friend who may miss you and just be happy to hear from you. Those little acts, they're acts of service that get us out of our egos.
Exactly.
And they're spiritual practices that benefit us and at the same time happen to be good for others. So
thank you, Phil.
Thanks for mentioning that.
I just want to really thank you for all of us, because this has been a fantastic discussion. I want to draw people's attention to the chat, because David Hayen and Lisa McCulloch and other people have made some comments that are really, really interesting. So take a look at your chat. And we're going to now, let me see, we're going to have a spin pretty soon for one of Phil's books. And I'm going to ask you real quick, Phil, about things that you want to promote. I think your new ebook has been reduced.
Yes, this, I should say, well, Spiritual Practice for Crazy Times is out. It's in paperback. There's an audio book that I narrated. I like to say Morgan Freeman wasn't available, so I had to narrate it myself. And those are, you know, available at the usual places, but also the ebook version for Kindle and those other platforms. I wanted to mention that the publisher and I agreed to make that only $1.99, just so more people, because we feel the book is useful in these times. And so because ebooks don't require the same cost of production, they kept it at $1.99. So if you read that way, or you have friends who read that way, you have a cheap gift for people. So I want to mention that. I also want to mention my podcast, Spirit Matters. I co-host it. We've been doing it for about 4 years. It's free. There are 230 some odd interviews with spiritual teachers, of an inventory, you could say, an archive of really useful stuff. Those are the latest three, but there are people on there that you'll recognize, famous people, people who should be famous, and you'll find it a great resource. And you know, it's what we do it. It's our little service.
That's wonderful. Okay. Morali was flashing some of the information about that. That's really incredible. I'm going to invite Robin right now to tell us about a couple of our programs coming up, and then I have breaking news on another speaker that's coming.
Okay, well, thank you, Diana. So we have the next two speakers are both, you know, interesting, as we try hard to make sure that happens. The next one is a little unusual. This isn't a super well-known author, but this is a woman who has dedicated her life to studying labyrinths and where they are in the world, how we can use this ancient method of connecting, you know, in a meditative way, in the spirit of labyrinth. How can we do that in new ways in modern times? So, Ancient Paths for Modern Times is the title, and Lisa Gidlow Moriarty. Sorry, I was kind of stumbling on that pronunciation. Anyway, she's come to us from one of our members, Peter Havlin, has worked with her and is really loves what she's doing. And she's also working with a nonprofit called the Labyrinth Project that's connecting the labyrinths all around the world, energetically and spiritually and actually physically, with, you know, taking some of the materials from one to the other. It's kind of an interesting thing. But in this, what you'd learn about is how you can integrate the use of labyrinth into your life in different ways, for milestones, for use in ceremony, for meditation practice to supplement what you're already doing. So she's got a whole also inventory of things you can do with labyrinth specifically. So that should be really neat. And then the next speaker we have coming up is actually someone I'm super excited about myself, and that's Penny Pierce. I actually it took me 4 months, I think, to read her book, Transparency, gosh, it's been about 1.5 years, 2 years ago when it came out. It was her 4th book, and it's really an amazing combination of science, quantum physics, spirituality, psychology. It talks about liminal space and transition and all kinds of things, in sort of framing it in new ways that, for me, that was really enlightening. So I really love her work. She's a neat lady. I think many of us haven't heard much about her yet, but she's going to be with us on the 14th of October. So both of those next ones, hopefully we'll see you back for. And I'm going to turn it back to Diana.
I can't wait for the transparency one. I think she's amazing. We just confirmed yesterday that to me, one of the greatest spiritual teachers in the world, someone who always, as long as I've known him, walks his talk, and that's Alan Cohen. One of his first books was Dragon Doesn't Live Here Anymore. He was one of our original speakers at the Inside Edge. He has a quote on his website that says, "Always act like you're wearing an invisible crown." And that crown for the crown chakra too, of being in your most divine self all the time. He is going to be with us on the 28th of October. And when Paul and I went to the Soviet Union, which was where this whole idea for the Inside Edge was born in 1985, he was the first person I met on that trip. And he walked into the room. He was with a man who was mentally challenged, and all I could notice was his absolute benevolence and kindness and compassion for this man. And he's just been, to me, he represents really walking the talk.
So my final words to you are, please remember that you have a sanctuary of peace within you that is what you are and is the core of your being. And that sanctuary of peace is also a fortress of strength. It's where to go. It's where you'll find refuge. It's where you find self-protection. And the inventory of spiritual practices are meant as aids to bring you there. But it is also a platform for effective action in the world. It is not an escape mechanism. It's preparation for activity. So you will do whatever you do in the world with more compassion, more wisdom, more energy if you go in first and then come out. That's the formula that all the spiritual traditions offer us. And the world needs you to make it a little bit more sane. So since we have a few minutes, let's all sit comfortably and close our eyes, and we'll have a group blessing. And just allow your body to settle down. And in this increased calmness, imagine in the center of your chest, in the area we think of as the heart center, the heart chakra, a ball of pure, radiant, celestial light that is the divinity within us. And its nature is love. And imagine that ball of love and light expanding upward and downward until it fills your whole body, so that you, in this form of divinity called you, that you call I or me, is filled with radiant love and light. And now imagine that light expanding outward beyond the confines of your body to fill the space you're in and to fill the neighborhood you're in, and further outward to fill the region you're in and the country you're in and the continent you're in. And further outward, spreading that love and light to all the continents, to Africa and South America and Europe and Asia and all the islands and nations and oceans, until your love and light fills our entire wounded planet with healing, love, and divine light. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. May all beings everywhere be happy and at peace. You might think that or say it aloud with me. May all beings everywhere be happy and at peace.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Phil.
Mm-hmm.
All beings, you've been a blessing to us today. I'm So, so grateful. I'm grateful to you, and I'm grateful to Morali, who's been our tech person today, and Robin. Robin, you are an angel in all of our lives, for sure, with all that you're doing to help us. I want to remind everybody that you can look at your email and find the recording link. You could probably share that with some friends that you'd like to do that with. And I'm inviting all of you to go to your reaction button and give some clapping hands like for Phil. And you can all also take you can unmute yourselves and we can all take a few moments to say hi or goodbye and sign off on our meeting today. Looking forward so much to the meeting next week. I love seeing you all, your beautiful faces. You're so precious to me.
Thank you. I'm grateful to be with
Diana.
you.
Yes, thank you, Phil.